advantage of clean energy opportunities. And I believe by doing this, we can really demonstrate leadership in both climate change mitigation and adaptation. We know that when we talk amongst ourselves of the need to respond to and remain resilient in the face of climate change, but the reality is that we certainly are amongst the most vulnerable and are very much victims of climate change impacts. And so it makes sense then that we as Indigenous peoples, that we demonstrate leadership and real efforts on this, not just within the boundaries of Canada, but I think globally as well. We think about our hearts and our prayers, and our efforts are going out to those impacted by the flooding happening right now across the prairies, and we keep hearing about these 1,000-year or 100-year incidences that are occurring. Major damages to the roads and infrastructure in the north, and practical challenges, like a container of milk being $12 or $13. It's both the climate change impacts, the increased energy costs, the cost of gasoline, transportation, and so it adds to the sense of vulnerability of our people. I know that my late grandfather would tell me about the not so subtle shift happening in our marine ecosystem on the west coast, and the changes in the patterns of the fish, and we see the diminishing fish stocks, in all of the really all of the watersheds are being majorly impacted. These are the daily challenges that as Indigenous peoples that we're experiencing, and I do believe that we are and will continue to play an increasingly important leadership role in the management of the environment and reflecting on our relationship with the environment through the lens of our teachings and our historic ability to demonstrate the ability to use, manage, and conserve the land. I know I often reflect back on the Rio Declaration in the early 90s, suggesting perhaps one of the major international events that First Nations, that as Indigenous peoples, we must be involved in defining sustainability, and the declaration from Rio providing a formal role for our people in environmental management through observations and of course through the maintenance and the use of our traditional knowledge. I think that clean energy and carbon finance, that these efforts can go hand in hand with our ability to manage the environment, and of course I believe we're best positioned to monitor the burden on the forests in biomass energy generation, that we as First Nations are best situated to do that. In terms of carbon and emission trading, this is, as we know, one way to mitigate the impacts of climate change, that it's important we've come to understand and in consideration for the management of our territories and for conservation in the face of climate change. I know that when I first had that being approached by the energy company 15 or so years ago, that while it was a very new concept then, that it's been emerging, and I feel strongly that our involvement in the trading schemes is necessary. We know that the market system development has been occurring by and large without Indigenous peoples, and we must be involved in this. I feel that it can be something that benefits all of us, that gives us also that leadership role in confronting climate change, but also creating economic potential. I know that that there's also been been developments that support First Nations to access funds or credits for various areas, including forest management and afforestation, landfill gas capture, combustion, reducing tillage and agriculture. I've spoken about solar, and of course there's also wind, biomass energy, wastewater management, anaerobic biodigesters in terms of taking organic waste and converting the gases for use in power. There are definitely challenges for us in the management of carbon finance due to regulatory and legislative schemes, the development of these systems. Provincial governments are developing carbon finance cap-and-trade regimes without working with us, overstepping not only the over 40 court cases recognizing the existence of Aboriginal title rights and treaty rights, but overstepping more recent developments in international law, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And these schemes, they're very much impacting our interests, they're impacting our forests, and there is the parceling out of resources without our involvement, and this absolutely oversteps our authorities. So we can say that the current carbon cap and trade system does not adequately represent First Nations interests. They're overlooking both the rights issues as well as the social issues, the equality issues, and the economic interests of First Nations. And I think this is a real challenge. In reflecting on some of the great development work that's been pulled together by CEIR, and it's very clear that capacity building is an important part of the overall effort. The need for research and more capacity for adaptation and mitigation will be needed as part of our efforts to address the issues around governance and management in response to the impacts of climate change. There's definite need to support First Nations involvement in the negotiations and the development of technology activities in this area, including mechanisms that are directed towards capacity building. So our objective is to build the capacities so that First Nations can participate in and benefit from the existing and emerging carbon and emission trading market. I believe that there's four major elements that our involvement in setting carbon finance policy is crucial. The first is advocacy by First Nations needed to ensure that regulatory barriers do not prohibit the transfer of technology and hinder innovation and development in the clean energy sector. And secondly, that what's required to this end is to implement a First Nations specific carbon offset and green technology fund. And thirdly, that this is important to manage the use of and conservation of our lands, our territories. That is consistent with our title and treaty rights to our territories and the ecosystems that where we come from. And fourthly, that this is something that, with our involvement, will assist all Canadians, as First Nations can then bring, as was the vision in the Rio Declaration in '91, the vision of Indigenous knowledge, to bring it to bear. So it's important that our interests are accommodated, that these schemes are established in a manner that respects and responds to the rights and interests of First Nations, and that the accommodation must be based very much on open dialogue, meaningful consultation and negotiation in order to maximize the economic, social, and cultural benefits for First Nations and their communities. And as I said, it must be consistent with emerging international norms like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that the First Nations Carbon Collaborative, the FNCC, is a critical initiative, given that the rights that I'm describing of First Nations, the carbon contained within their lands, is recognized, and that the potential revenues associated with this carbon be recognized by, in this case in particular, the Canadian government. And that it will be important for the collaborative, the FNCC, to address a significant gap that exists in research and capacity development for First Nations that are interested in accessing carbon rights markets and the potential revenues, and provide policy and decision makers with a high level of review and analysis of carbon rights and policies. It's very clear in some of the case studies of examples of Indigenous participation, whether it's in North America, the United States or Canada, other parts of the world, New Zealand and Australia, that as Indigenous peoples, as First Nations, that we must assert our rights and develop the capacity to access the world's developing carbon markets. And it certainly has begun with the leadership of a few, thinking about the Carriers Sekani, the Tribal Council, the Poplar River First Nation, and the Teegee are examples that are really developing, I think, an important sense of leadership of efforts that are underway that we can build on. And that First Nations are determining the offsets in their territories, exploring rights and capacity for accessing markets. We need to determine how to engage in carbon conservation without unfairly limiting the rights of Indigenous peoples in their territories. I think there's often a sense that there can be, albeit well-intended efforts both on conservation